Hey, this is Goutam. Stéphane, do you want to
Hello, this is Stéphane. So just as we let people come in and continue come in, just to say I'm professor of strategy and organizational innovation at IMD. My name is Stéphane Girod.
And hello there. Greetings. This is Goutam Challagalla, as well from IMD. I'm a professor of strategy and marketing. Really delighted to be with all of you while we wait for participants to join in.
So we have a first poll here.
So Stéphane, you're seeing the results come in. Is this what you had expected, or are you seeing some unexpected results?
29% of you think it is a buzzword, so it's a non-negligible portion. Although almost 64%, 63% to be precise, disagree that it would be a buzzword. And interestingly, 7% of you don't know, so sitting on the fence. So we're going to try and explore that.
Excellent point, Stéphane. I think let me go ahead and introduce the agenda. About a third of you felt it's a buzzword, 2/3 felt it is not a buzzword. And I think one of the things that Stéphane and I will do is try to put forth some arguments of why we believe agility is not so much of a buzzword. I think it is used. Every time we hear the word agility, I think it is overused from that standpoint. But overuse does not necessarily mean that it should end up becoming a buzzword. And part of what Stéphane and I will do is to try to clarify why it should not be a buzzword. Let's put it that way. And second thing is, I think one of the key things when it comes to agility is it's actually a capability that you can build for dealing with uncertainty. So if you think about COVID right now, there's a lot of uncertainty. And part of the arguments that we're going to make is that agility can actually help companies deal in very meaningful ways with uncertainty. So that's the second thing that we're going to dive into. Then the third one, and most of these will be through simple case studies and examples, is how can you increase agility in your own business? Okay. And then the last topic is how can companies transform for agility? And we're not going to say there's only one path that companies take. We are actually going to argue that there are different paths and different journeys that companies take. And part of what Stéphane and I are going to do is to give you examples of how companies have started the journey with one approach and over time they've evolved into something else. And so these are some of the things that Stéphane and I will be discussing with you all. I think one of the things we hope that everybody will get out of this session is what exactly is the definition of agility. And so we've given you a few options here, everything from Scrum to SAFe to DevOps to flexibility, design thinking, fast adaptation. Looks like that seems to be the winning horse right now. Also including things like lean startup and resilience. And this is really where Stéphane will come in and share, what exactly is his definition. And then I will come back later during the session to talk about how companies go through different approaches. So I think here, Stéphane, it looks like we do have a clear winner that is emerging.
Amazing. Yeah.
I think one thing, Stéphane, as you go through what you think is agility, it just struck me there's potentially one other question that we can think of is, how is this COVID-19 crisis, for example, leading companies to respond, and is there anything about agility there, right? And so I think it'll be good as you give your definition of agility, also to tie in to COVID-19 and how companies are responding.
Exactly. So 2/3 of you think it's about fast adaptation. So the importance of speed is central to how you see this. I think there's a non-negligible share of you with being flexible. So the aspect of flexibility. And then a few of you associated with various agile methods, but resilience is important. And in fact, I was discussing last week with the chief communication officer of Forbes, and he was telling me in the United States, when everyone talks about agility, they actually talk about resilience. Okay, so it's interesting that you're also making those connections. So thank you for sharing that. And what I would like to do is, as Goutam invited me, is what's the relationship between COVID crisis, a period for all of us with extremely high uncertainty, and agility. And to do that, I'm going to dive into an example, a company that you might have heard about, which is in the cosmetics industry. In fact, one of the world leaders, number one in Europe in the beauty industry, high-end segment, with 10,000 talents, a family-owned company created in 1954 that has presence almost all over the world, and does menswear and men's cosmetics and women's cosmetics. So they are using the COVID-19 crisis as an opportunity to accelerate on their digital transformation while experimenting with agility principles. And I would like to explain, first of all, why this is happening. So in this context, especially for consumer good companies, there is a push factor which is requiring to accelerate with digital transformation. And, you know, as most stores have been closed, the focus is really firmly now on e-commerce, first of all. The problem with a lot of consumer good companies like Clarins, but many others, is that they rely a lot on intermediaries, wholesalers, distributors, department stores, retailers. And a lot of them are closed. And not only that, is that a lot of them actually go bankrupt during this crisis. So there's a push factor for accelerating direct relationship with customers via digital. There are other pull reasons, right? So consumers all along the consumer journey actually want convenience in interactions. They want, you know, virtual demonstrators. They want to have more immersive experience. They want to pay digitally and shop very, very conveniently. So there's also a pull from the consumer side to accelerate with digital transformation. So we found here at IMD that digital transformation is one of the most difficult aspects for established businesses that are non-digital natives. And Clarins was no exception to that when the COVID crisis started. You know, so it had massively expanded in developing e-commerce boutiques into really strong CRM capabilities to derive analytical capabilities to do that. But it was also struggling against a number of rigidities, right? The first one is that, especially in the high-end segments, executives tend to be really clinging on the idea that in-store rituals are better to create an experience for consumers. So there has been resistance in the mindset in seeing the opportunities of digital. Like, for example, not shifting to digital marketing, for example. There is also a problem with the way a lot of companies are structured. You know, matrix structure with matrixed profit and loss statements are considerably slowing down how much you can shift resources around quickly to support digital transformation. And COVID-19 is even creating an extra layer of complexity because with the high level of uncertainty and the pressure companies have to cut down costs to save cash, it's very easy to actually start cutting down in the areas that are going to help you bounce back from the crisis, including digital. So what's happened? At the outset of this crisis, Clarins saw an opportunity to launch an organizational experiment using and deploying agility principle. So let me tell you how it's worked. The company has created what they call 3 squads, small, usually cross-functional teams focused on certain experimentation. So the first squad that has been created is actually working, of course, virtually, is the senior management of this company plus other top managers working on how can we increase and defend our business survivability, right? So things such as how do we preserve cash? How do we protect the health of our employees and our customers? How do we ensure the continuity of our operations as global supply chains are breaking down? These are examples of what these people are doing. And what is also very important is that Clarins has had some complexity in its organization in the sense that there's a lot of the power in this organization is with the country managers. To respond to the crisis, though, this squad is short-circuiting this traditional hierarchy and on behalf of the global organization, making instant decisions to protect how the companies will survive and the continuity of the business. And the way they do that, these 9 or 10 people in that squad, is they meet virtually and they have changed with using digital technology, the way they run these meetings, right? So it's really about defining a problem, gathering information, imagining options, making a decision, and immediately communicating to the whole organization what those decisions are so that they can give them a minimum sense of direction and stability, despite the turmoil going all over them. And then what Clarins also did, interestingly, was to create in each countries where it had a division, 2 sorts of squads. Small teams, cross-hierarchical, cross-functional, collaborating and empowered to develop solutions a little bit faster than what would be possible in the classic way of working with the bureaucratic working of the organization. And digital would be embedded in each of these squads in order to make possible and viable the solutions that they would like to take. So the what next squads were focusing on what is going to happen when the sanitary crisis recedes to reopen our operations, right? So how can we confidently reopen our offices, our factories, our stores, was one of the questions these squads would typically work on. Whereas the what if squads were looking at all the contingencies that were coming the way of Clarins, all the unknowns, all the uncertainties. So for example, what would happen if we can't reopen our stores in 3 weeks? What would happen if we had to impose using masks for our customers if they come in store? Would that turn them off or would that reassure them? These type of problems they would consider. So this was a way for Clarins to bring in at the core of the organization the uncertainty it was facing. And the additional thing you have to remember is how they've tried to create a global network of teams where using human dimensions and the capabilities of Microsoft Teams, they could share knowledge and inform one another to make better decisions. And these decisions and this knowledge was flowing from one type of squad to the other, but sometimes, for example, the What Next squads in Europe, which was earlier in the lockdown process than the United States, would inform the United States about what they were doing in Europe in order to reopen in better conditions. So the wheel of creating this knowledge network. So what's the impact of all that, right? So, for example, in Dubai, Clarins staff of these squads, as the 4 main stores were completely shut down, was able to create a home delivery system using the CRM and to send via people's mobile phones beauty advice. In France, the squads managed to create a system where consumers could book online apartments with the beauty advisors via FaceTime or Microsoft Teams and get some advice. And Clarins would, at the same time, with these advisors, would be able to sell and upsell, if you like, a certain amount of products. And these two sorts of initiatives kind of amortized the shock of the crisis and the physical stores being closed. But this created, of course, a collective level of energy in the company, helped people to focus on priority tasks, and increase their comfort with using digital tools throughout the organizations.
Excellent, Stéphane. Very nice. I see some questions coming in, and we should get to some of these questions. We may not be able to get to all. Stéphane, there are things like, how do we know what we should adapt to? We're talking about being agile, but is there a particular focus? I might be able to address that. Is it a state of mind? Is it a process? There was one question on, did you actually work with Clarins, and did Clarins move into a startup kind of a mode? And then there are, just questions around buzzwords. I think a lot of our participants are concerned that, there's digitization, digital transformation. What's the difference in all of these? We may not be able to get to all of these, but, maybe there are a couple here you could take right away. Did you work with Clarins, and did Clarins move into a startup mode, Stéphane?
I did a research with them, certainly, but at the moment, this is an experiment. But you're right, it's trying to bring in some of the spirit of the startup. So in reference to the buzzword, let me come back to that and draw some lessons from what we looked at here, from this story. What does it mean?
Yeah.
So as you can see with those what if, what next type of squads, clearly Clarins is trying to accelerate, respond faster to the rapid changes around it by empowering certain teams to test and learn and do things in function of their changing circumstances. So there was a notion of speed here and nimbleness for sure. However, it was not all about speed, right? With the What Now squad, this is about protecting the core business and creating a sense of stability and direction for employees. And on top of that, a key message also from this story is that those squads, although they were collaborating with the mainstream organization, were also clearly accountable on delivering certain objectives, right? So there is rigor and discipline despite all the experimentation that is going on. So from this case and many other companies that I've worked with in my studies, I found that the first characteristic of agility is that companies have to deal with a tension between nimble and stable. And when they do that, they're usually better able to bring and be prepared for the uncertainty around them. Second response in response to the buzzword thing is that there's a second level of concrete things you can do to make more agility in your organization. So the what now squad, short-circuiting, bypassing the bureaucracy and the traditional hierarchy, was a move towards simplifying the complexity of the organization, if you like. But the paradox is that Clarins is also a complex multinational organization. What makes sense in Asia or the Middle East might not make sense in Europe. That's why he had to build on that complexity to create the right solutions that would be relevant for the right circumstances. So if you simplify, it's never about oversimplifying. And on top of that, it's about creating and orchestrating the networks of knowledge and learning that goes with it. So agility is also about dealing with a second type of tension, which is simple and complex. Sometimes it makes sense to be complex. And when the organization finds the right ways of doing that, then perhaps it's also more sophisticated about how it responds to agility. So if I had one word, and some of you a quarter earlier in your poll referred to agility mostly about speed, I think this is a misinterpretation of this concept. Speed is very important, but you have also other dimensions you need to focus on if you want to build the capability for agility. The second remark that I want to give here is that Clarins, and never in my story did I say that they were trying to use Scrum or design thinking or lean startup, which are agile processes that you probably are all familiar with. What Clarins did instead, to be really concrete about what it should be doing, was to focus on principles of agility, right? The first one, as much as it was trying to improvise, it was also trying to protect a certain direction within a turbulent environment. The second one was that as it was trying to create rules of accountability, it was also trying to go fast. So you could see that agility is about going slow to go faster. Fourth principle is about, you want to standardize, centralize certain elements of your organization, but you can never go too far in there. You have to differentiate because very often you have different business units and different countries. And as much as you want to eliminate redundancies, you still have to keep redundancies. Knowledge is costly to manage. Learning is costly to manage. But if you don't create that, then you will never be able to actually build that agility that your company needs and responds to changing circumstances. So making sure that every teams and every employee is more than the sum of these parts. So before Goutam comes back in, my final message here is that agile processes are methodologies. What every business needs in uncertain time is business agility. And this is a capability grounded in very concrete principles. So I hope that clarifies your questions. And I would like to turn now to, do we have more questions, Goutam, at this time?
We do, and we'll have to come back to some of them. What I will do, Stéphane, is take about 15 minutes or so, 15, 20 minutes. That'll give you a chance to scan through. There's some very good questions around Clarins. so that at the end we can come back. So if you would, potentially stop sharing and turn it over now to me. I will switch to my screen now. And, I think what Stéphane did really wonderfully is give a very concrete example of a company and particularly how it is dealing with COVID with a pretty nice level of detail. My job is to take a step back now and say, is Clarins, the way Clarins is doing it, is that the only way? Or are there other paths that companies can take to agility? And I think what we'll do, Stéphane, in the interest of time is, do I turn this back to you for this particular poll? I think you have to launch this poll. So if you could just launch the poll.
Yeah.
Very quick thing. Is it a permanent state? Is it, how are you approaching agility in your company? And that's really what we want to get at. Are there different approaches that companies are taking, and what specifically might be your approach? And what we see here is about just over a third of you have said you focus on agility in parts of your organization. And I think that's going to be by far the most common approach. And I'm going to talk about that. But I'm very impressed that in about a third, you say this is a permanent state that you're trying to achieve. And I would love to, I'll share some examples of how companies are trying to get to that permanent state, and maybe what you're doing will be similar or not. Those are the two big ones. Some of you are focusing on during a crisis, not surprising. I think COVID is forcing a lot of companies to do that. And some of you are saying you're trying to be quite deliberate and launch it to the whole company. So, this is very useful because this really sets up my discussion to what are really 4 ways in which companies approach agility. Before I get to that, I just want to contextualize, right? Because today, in the period of COVID, there's something quite interesting going on. In almost any company and an organization, there are now, what COVID has done is, there are some areas of a company where you might have surpluses, meaning you have more capacity than you need. Maybe your manufacturing plants have not been working for the last couple of months, right? Then you have a surplus. Maybe there are certain functions in your organization that don't have as much work. If you're in a sales force, you could not go and call on customers, and sometimes customers are not willing to meet, then you have a surplus. But there may be other functions where there are shortages, right? In the case of Clarins, I think what Stéphane showed is, hey, stores and salespeople in the stores were your surpluses. And the shortages were online. So what this company did is they moved the surpluses from one function into where a shortage was. So that's one way they became a lot more agile. Is often it is about balancing demand and supply, right? At the end of the day, it is balancing demand and supply. So in a COVID world, what we are noticing is a lot of the agility is really about rebalancing demand and supply, or surpluses and moving them to shortages. And that's really the types of agilities. And we are seeing that this can happen both inside the company as well as outside the company. It can happen with people. So for example, Danone took its salespeople and they went and helped in the supply chain side. Some of them, right? So that's internal. You're moving people, surpluses to shortages. You can also do this outside the company. As an example, Qantas Airlines, we all know airlines are going through massive amounts of pain right now. And so what Qantas Airlines did was 2/3 of its employees, about 20,000, they didn't know what to do with them, and they don't want to pay their salaries. So they quickly called other parts of the economy that were booming. And this is in Australia, Qantas Airlines. And they saw that grocery stores were booming, delivery systems were booming. And those companies needed surpluses, right? They had massive shortages. They couldn't have enough people. So what Qantas did is they went external. Their CEO called these companies and they said, hey, why don't you take our people? And same thing McDonald's did with Aldi. So you can do this. What we're seeing in the time of COVID is the surpluses and shortages being rebalanced both inside the company as well as outside. I think some very exciting things outside, some with people, some with infrastructure, lending your trucks, lending your supply chain capacity to somebody who may need it. So we are seeing a lot of those types of very quick, adjustments, agile kinds of moves being made by companies. So what this triggered in our mind, as Stéphane and I, we were sitting and thinking about, is there a framework? Are companies sort of approaching agility in different ways? We wanted to not just focus on COVID, but also in general. Because, once COVID is over, hopefully, you also need a way to think about agility in a more permanent way. And so with that, we created a very simple 2x2 matrix. And I think you'll find this 2x2 matrix quite helpful, hopefully. One way in which companies begin this agility journey is what we are calling as episodic. It is triggered by some particular event. Right now, it might be triggered by COVID. It doesn't have to be triggered by COVID. I'll give you an example of a company where it was very poor customer satisfaction survey results that triggered a potential change. So some companies, they begin with some episode, and that's why we're calling it episodic, but they focus on really working through that episode. Some companies actually think of agility on a more permanent and continuous basis, where they are doing agility all the time. So that's the difference between episodic and continuous. So when some of you said it's a more permanent state, I think you were probably referring to continuous. What we've also noticed from our own research and working with companies is some tend to do it in a very localized way. What I mean by that is it could be some function. It's the customer support people, or it is the software development people, the IT people who are doing agile development. It could be function, or maybe it's a particular geography. In some cases, it could be a business unit in a larger corporation. But all that is localized. It's happening in very specific pockets. It's not happening throughout. So as you can imagine, the other end is it's organization-wide. So this is, how we see companies approach agility is there are all these, 4 potential journeys that companies are taking in dealing with agility. So very quickly here, many of the COVID initiatives and examples are actually in this lower left. Not everybody, I think Clarins doesn't fit there, but many of the examples that we're giving actually fit right there. This rebalancing of surpluses and shortages, they fit there. And actually, we have found from our research, this is often the starting point for many companies. And I will give you an example now, okay? If we take a step back now and look at agility in a more broader way, we can look and ask this question, who is the world's, best bank? And this is a bank out of Singapore where they got 3 awards. They're the only bank in the world to have all agility awards simultaneously. And this is DBS Bank. And what DBS Bank discovered is, they were regarded as one of the 10 best, business transformations of the last decade. DBS was not always the great bank that they are today. At one time, people would refer to DBS, right? The letters D, B, and S as damn bloody slow. So they weren't always great, right? They had their fair share of trouble. And what was going on is that they were getting a lot of complaints. In fact, it was so frustrating within the bank that, I'm going to read out a statement by their chief operating officer who said, if an operations person wanted to change something, they had to talk to control, who then sent them to compliance, who then sent them to legal, who then sent them to audit. And this would be this continuous. Each one is trying to get, shift things to the others, and they were slow as hell. So they got a new CEO who said, listen, we got to fix this, right? And they said, we're not going to try to do everything. We're going to be very targeted. And that's why I call this episodic and sort of localized. It's really focusing only on customer journeys. They said, our goal, our aspiration, and they call this hardware, this is an aspiration, is we want to deliver the best-in-class customer service experience. All right? So they set that as the goal for the company. Now, what many companies do, and DBS also did this, is they say, oh, okay, how do I improve this, right? They said, training. Let's give our people tools, design thinking, customer journey mapping, all of these training tools they gave them. They call this hardware. Now, what happens in many companies is management says, well, we've got the aspiration and the goal. Now we've given people training, let them run with it. Unfortunately, it doesn't often work that way. A lot of resources actually get wasted because there isn't enough momentum in the company. So what DBS said is, I need a connecting mechanism to meet our goals. I need something in between that can take this aspiration, take this training, and make it real. So what the company did was they picked 6 customer journeys, just 6. So for example, in a bank, it might be you want to open an account. How long does it take? Or you lose a credit card. Or you're a B2B, you want to set up trade finance for international, foreign exchange, whatever, right? These are some of the things that you want to do. And so what they did is they said, we need this connecting tissue. And that's where they turned to what they called as, they never called it agility. They called it, hey, let's do these process improvement events. They called them PIEs. And what's fascinating about what DBS did is they said, we are going to improve every process, each of these 6 processes in just 5 days. Day 1, we're going to map the process. And by the way, they brought every single leader whose function touches this process into the same room. So it wasn't lower level. They brought the most senior people. 5 days, you're not going to, you're going to be committed to this. So all the senior leaders like legal, audit, compliance, risk, all of them were in there, customer support, etc. So for any particular journey, they got these people. Day 1, you map the journey. Day 2, you come up with improvements. Day 3, alignment. Day 4 and 5, come up with a plan. And within 2 months, we got to re-engineer it. And that's sort of how they went. It was very targeted. It was episodic, focused on solving a business problem, but also tied to their company's aspiration. And the goal that they said is number of customer hours saved. That's the metric that we're going to use. This turned out to be amazingly successful. So eventually what DBS did is they rolled this out to about 350 processes in the company, each process being led by a senior leader of the company. Okay, so what the DBS story is, it started episodic, sort of a dabbler. It's a few customer journeys. I call them dabblers. And that's where they started with 6 specific journeys. And then they became proponents. It became organization wide. It's 350 leaders. Process in India maybe need to be a little bit different from the process in China. And so that's where they sort of scaled it up, rolled it out to different geographies, and DBS became a proponent. And I would say potentially Clarins began its journey there. They may not stop there, but these were all episodic, triggered by specific things, and that's sort of been DBS's journey, right? Now, what's very interesting is, can you now one day shift this into a continuous? And my guess is DBS is trying to move into the continuous side, as is Clarins. But let me give you examples of companies that actually think of agility slightly differently. And they started with solving a different problem and then ended up with agile as the solution and made it completely continuous. So let me give you some examples here. So if on the left side, you're dabblers and proponents, then on the right side, I call these, carders and devotees. Carders is just a subset of devotees. So I'm going to focus mainly my time on how you don't get caught up in the buzzwords. You don't necessarily need squads and all of that, but you can actually do agility in a very smart way. So let me give you 2 specific examples where this becomes actually a part of the culture with some very key foundational principles here. So let me give you one example. In Europe, Booking.com is super popular. It's just like Expedia in the US, or Make My Trip in India, or C-Trip in China, and so on, right? This is the leading online travel platform, right? So super successful, 2017, everything is working. Booking.com is doing very well. But something quite interesting happens. One day, one of the employee walks in and says, I think we need to change the complete interface. Our landing page. Remember, if you're only an online company, your landing page is super important. So the company had spent hours, hundreds of thousands of hours optimizing that landing page. And here comes an employee and says, I think we can do much better. And if we move away from our current landing page into something quite different. CEO said, are you crazy? This is going to cause confusion among our loyal employees, our loyal customers. And many of the senior leaders were dead against it. They said, come on, we've spent all this time optimizing. What do you mean you want to go and change it? But they still allowed it. And the reason they allowed it is said, in our company, we have a very core principle. Anybody can test anything they want. Obviously, there is going to be some boundaries and some limits, which I'm going to talk about, but they gave this person permission. Now, you're not going to change everything in every geography, but you can go run some tests, right? And that's what they want you to do. But they could not object because this was a foundational principle. And the question is, why? Why does a company like Booking have a principle like this? And what I want to say is Amazon has exactly the same kind of a principle. And so why do they have this? Here is the real reason why these companies do agility. Okay. And the way they do it is, here's the rationale for how they approach it and the business problem they're trying to solve. What Amazon, the Booking.coms have discovered is there is a wall. We think about silos. There are walls from one function to another function. They said, yeah, those walls might exist, but those are not the big walls. The big wall is between us and the customers. We are clueless. We may be clever. We may hire the smartest people, but we are often clueless about customer needs. And what they also discovered is many times customers themselves don't know their own needs. Even customers are clueless about their own needs. So if we are not so smart about customer needs, and customers themselves are not so smart about their own needs, then how do you solve this problem? Because it causes lots of uncertainty, right? You launch a product, you don't know if it's going to be successful. So what these companies have done is, their approach to agility is mainly to solve this problem of uncertainty, saying it's very hard for us to know what will work with customers. This is, in fact, a way to become more customer-centric. So we don't know their problems. They themselves don't know what they want. They can't tell us very clearly. So this is how we are going to solve the uncertainty kind of a problem. So I want you to remember these words. A key purpose of agility is to manage uncertainty and to mitigate risk, so that you can actually discover new opportunities. And the question is how, if you want to do this on a continuous basis. And what these companies have discovered is, if you want to do this on a continuous basis, here are some key things. It comes down to 3 foundational behaviors. If you truly want agility in your company to take hold, don't think of it as agility and buzzwords. Think about, how do we solve customer problems, reduce uncertainty, and discover new opportunities in a smarter way than we may be doing today. That's really what Booking and Amazon were trying to solve. And they've discovered its 3 key behaviors. First, I've already gone through this, but it's 3 key behaviors. First is, we can't have one small group, a market research group or a sales group that is bringing in all the ideas and the intelligence about what's happening outside. We need more eyes and windows into the world. And so they said, market intelligence and idea generation should be organization-wide. Any employee in Booking might come up with an idea, like the example I gave you, to change the landing page. Any employee in Amazon could come up with an idea. Maybe it's a driver of a truck, might think about packaging to be different because they're having difficulty handling the packaging, or they see consumers having difficulty carrying a package perhaps inside, right? So anybody should be able to do that. That's where the continuous thing. But then you need quick sharing mechanisms. And by the way, sharing mechanisms are not necessarily IT tools. Those are not necessarily IT tools. You could use IT tools. In Amazon, it's very simple. You write a 1-page memo and you share it with your team and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking of. Here is my hypothesis. And this is why I think this idea would be better. No big PowerPoints, no big studies, no big market research. I'm just going to share it through a 1-page memo. Okay, and there's a particular format they use. And then you do very quick testing and iteration. So the speed part of agility is only the 3rd part, right? It's number 3, and that's useful. So these are mechanisms like fast testing, iteration, are mechanisms to reduce risk, but those are enablers. Don't forget that these companies are truly solving the problem of mitigating risk or managing uncertainty. And if you do this repeatedly, time and again, then it becomes a competency, a core capability in your organization where you can pivot faster, whether it is going into new markets, whether it is launching new products, you're able to pivot much faster and actually manage this uncertainty in more reasonable ways. So what I want you to think about is, these are 3 core behaviors that are the foundation for agility. And by the way, these are the same 3 behaviors that make companies more customer-centric as well. Okay, so with that, I'll give you one simple thing that Amazon does, and then we'll go through the lessons, Stefan and I, a few core lessons. What Amazon does is, every problem they convert and say, is this a one-way door or a 2-way door? A one-way door is, once I go through the door, I can't come back. So if I'm putting up a warehouse somewhere, then I need to spend some time studying it. But majority of the problems we deal with are two-way doors, meaning I can make a mistake and correct it quickly. And so that's what they do. They converted most problems into two-way doors, saying, that's how I'm going to mitigate the risk. So with that, Stéphane, perhaps I'll let you go through some of the key lessons here.
First of all, thank you very much, Goutam. I responded to a few questions during your time also. Just before we go there, in the matrix, if you go back to the matrix,
certainly,
and if we go back to one of the questions one of you gave me at the beginning, my understanding is that in terms of journey, the difference with DBS here that try to work in a localized way on certain processes is that Clarins has launched an organization-wide initiative.
That's correct.
Right? So, and at the moment you could say it's episodic, right?
That's right.
Because it's just the beginning.
It's just the beginning.
The question they have, and then I ask them, I don't know if they have the answer yet, is once the sanitary crisis recedes, do they want to move to the devotees quadrant where it becomes a permanent state? And
exactly.
So I think they would like that. So let's see what happens. So in response to your question earlier, we'll have to wait and see. I will update you perhaps in 1 year.
And that's a good point, Stéphane. I think if we look at like what the DBSs are doing, that's exactly where they're going. They're actually trying to become devotees and become, part of the culture. But often the journey doesn't start there.
Right.
And it's a mistake to just, anyway, I'll let you talk about the first two messages. I'll do the last, that agility is a lot more than speed. I'll turn it over to you, Stéphane.
Yeah, so I think that if we want to summarize, right, what is agility concretely and what are the principles you want to use to make your organization more agile, I shouldn't say more agile, your organization with greater agility. And one of you mentioned, by the way, and several of you in your questions, what are the links between strategy, operational agility? And I just want to say that what we focused on, Goutam and I, today is mostly the organizational level. But of course, you're right, you have to think about strategic agility. In my forthcoming book with Martin Kralik next year in Kogan page, we are going to look at a third layer, which is the leadership agility, which also helps to cement the two, right? So in essence, okay, you have to think about speed of adaptation, but I think agility, the key word you want to remember is how to be flexible, right? Instead of choosing or being either stable or too nimble or complex and not enough simple, it's how do you try to articulate and try to achieve both objectives at the same time. And of course, for very different companies, how they do that will look very different, okay? Second lesson is, that's the reason I say I don't want to use the word agile. I have many clients at IMD who refer of agile as the A word in their organization and they don't want to use it. But what they need is business agility or organizational agility, call it as you want. Remember that, think about those principles of agility before you think about just necessarily the agile method. Sometimes the agile methods will be important, but in some context, they won't be. And don't get into dogma. Invent your way. Agility is about flexibility, including in how you design your organization and your operations to make it alive. Let me finish with the two final conclusions, which was what Goutam's important messages was what, companies will take different journeys and will achieve different degrees of agility. Some will want a more permanent state, some will want a state that is more localized in certain operations. So this is where we were saying the approach to agility is always flexible, okay? It's about building the capability, right? It's when, and that's perhaps coming back finally with the DBS case, the Clarins story, is that once your employees are used to these ways of working, once management is used to that too, you have put the systems behind it, you have put the structure, you have certain core values, you have put some incentives and metrics, then it becomes probably a cultural core competence. So I want to leave you with that message. On behalf of Goutam, myself, and IMD, again, thank you very much for making the time. Please send us your feedback. I hope this session was really useful for you and make these things much more concrete. Bye-bye and stay safe.